welcome to another edition of Book Talk. I'm Stephen Usery, and I'm delighted to welcome Tova Mirvis back to the WYPL radio studios again. Tova, thank you so much for dropping by.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tova is a writer who grew up in Memphis, but now makes her home in Massachusetts. Her previous novels are The Ladies' Auxiliary, The Outside World, and Visible City. And she's also written a memoir entitled The Book of Separation. Today we're going to be discussing her most recent novel entitled We Would Never, which is available from Avid Reader Press, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster. Tova, We Would Never begins in Maine in 2019 with someone watching an interrogation video. Who is being interrogated and why are they being questioned?
Well, the book starts off in the middle of the night. You're not quite sure who the woman is who's watching an interrogation of a woman who is under suspicion for the murder of her husband. And I'm not going to give too much away, but I will say that she has a very strong connection to this case. She is watching it and really fascinated by, can she believe the person who is being interrogated? How much can we peer into someone and know what are they hiding and what are they telling that is actually true?
Now, the book is really for people out there more a family story and the dynamics inside this family. But then you've put that stakes really high with someone having been murdered.
Right. On one hand, the book is a murder mystery, you could say, on one level. I mean, it's a mystery about how a seemingly nice, ordinary family in South Florida comes to maybe or maybe not hire a hitman to kill their ex-son-in-law in a divorce. And so on one hand, that is the central plot. But I feel like really the real mystery of the book is about family. I think families are the biggest mystery and the hardest to solve sorts of mysteries that we face. And I think really at its heart, We Would Never is a mystery about family loyalty and about family love. It's about the mystery of anger, how people spiral out of control, how people lose a sense of their own moral compasses and do things that they would never think they would actually do.
Now, your mother is sitting in the studio with us. How does she feel when you present these complicated pictures of family?
Well, I have to say, I have written books that do sort of borrow a little more fully from my own life and my own family. We Would Never is really not taken from my own family dynamics. I think, for every book you have some personal connection. I think to write a novel about something, it takes so many years, and to be able to sit with it for so long, I think it has to hit you in some raw, vulnerable spot. It's like that, feeling of a match striking against some, sandpapery part of your own self. And for me, certainly the subject of divorce is something that I know a lot about, having been divorced. But this book is not drawn from my own divorce. It was actually inspired by a true crime story that I had a very, very tangential connection to. But as much as I used a real life news story, I was able to pull on my own understanding, I think, of divorce and my own experience of the way that divorce can really unmoor you so fully. It can really destabilize your sense of who you are in the world. And so that's sort of the personal connection to this subject matter, but not my own family. Mom, you don't have to worry. This was not our family.
So what you're saying is you did not kill your ex-husband?
No. My divorce was not fun, but there were no murders. It was not like that. I think, as a writer, you're always mining for material. And so what I took was the emotional feeling of devastation, of unsettling anxiety, of anger, and maybe an awareness of how things could spiral out of control. But, really, for the vast majority of divorces, it's not fun. People get really angry and there's so much pain. And most people move on. They move on with their lives and they rebuild and they start again. And I think what fascinated me for this book was this true crime story that is based on a real story that's in the news now and, 10 years ago when it first happened, in which a family conspired to hire a hitman to kill their ex-son-in-law. And I think what drew me to this true crime story was these were not people with a criminal record. I don't believe they're psychopaths. They started off like so many people, and they let the divorce take them over and escalate so wildly out of control. And I think I was so fascinated just as a watcher of this true story to really try to understand what sets apart a divorce where people get mad and people get over it from a divorce where things are so out of control. I mean, we see these stories in the news every once in a while, these horrible spousal murder cases. And I really was so curious to understand what is different about these cases. Why is no one in these stories ever able to back down? Why can no one forgive? And I think I wondered, how far apart are the seemingly normal stories from these horrible, tragic stories? Are we separated from them by inches, or are we separated by miles?
I can almost see it as a microcosm of our current political state, in that things we thought were unthinkable 10 years ago are now every day.
Right. I mean, this phrase, "we would never," I mean, that was what was so interesting to me about the title, that I think we believe in so many contexts, so many ways, this is something that would never happen, both on the political level and on the personal level. I think on the personal level, we think, I would never do such a thing, or that could never happen in my world, or that could never happen to people I know, or in a country I know. And yet, I think one of the shocks we face, in so many spheres, is that things we think are unimaginable are not always quite so unimaginable. And I feel it even just on the personal level. I think that what I was so interested in the book was exploring characters who, I felt fully would have believed that they would never do something like this. And I think we as readers approach these characters and, we look at them from our safe readerly perspective on the outside and think, we would never do this. But I don't know. I'm not convinced that we always know what we might do in situations we cannot imagine. It's easy to say we would never, but I don't know that that's always so true.
Has there ever been an instance on a very minor point where you go, oh, didn't know I had that in me?
Sure. I mean, from the smallest thing to the larger things. I mean, certainly getting divorced. I did not think that I would ever be someone who was divorced. I just didn't imagine, very few people go into a marriage thinking that you're going to end up divorced. And maybe just as I've gotten older, I realize so much of life, we don't know what is going to happen. I, think about friends of mine who are undergoing painful things, from physical illnesses to emotional illnesses. We don't know. We don't know what life has in store for us. We don't know how we will face those moments. And I think one of the things maybe I've learned as I've gotten older is to not use that phrase, "I would never." I just think we don't know what life hands to us. And I think so many people find themselves in immensely painful places or complicated places. And certainly in my book, one of the questions is so much about, what would you do to protect your child? What would you do if you feel, rightly or wrongly, that your child is in danger? And I think in those moments, we do things that we might not have expected of ourselves.
And what is an appropriate level of threat to respond to?
Right. Certainly, I do not advise people to do what the characters in my book do. I do not feel this is like a how-to manual for how to make it through a divorce. But my characters begin, there's, parents who watch their daughter go through a divorce. They feel that the situation is escalating and the anger is so enormous. And I was fascinated by, how do people come off the rails? How do people, come into these moments where they can't control the anger? And particularly with forgiveness, what makes it so hard to relent, to just soften sometimes and say, you know what? This is not going to go well. When I watch this true crime story, which I still follow, it is in the media a lot and will be over the next few months. I think one of the things, I look at this family who did hire a hitman and think, how could you think this was going to go well? I mean, how was there no moment that not one of you said, this is not only going to kill a man, the father of our grandchildren, but this is going to destroy all of us. Everyone in the wake of this crime is destroyed. And I look at it and just wonder why couldn't you back down? I want to take those real people and say, didn't you know it was going to end so terribly for everyone?
I've been recently playing with the idea that so many bad things happen in our world because of a unrealistic expectation of positive outcome. We say, everything's going to be fine.
Right. Maybe it's the downside of being an optimist, to believe that everything is going to be fine. I think maybe there's almost a protective stance of being negative about things, to think, things are always going to end up bad. Or, the phrase, it can't get worse. Sometimes it can. And that is a hard lesson to learn, I think, that it can get worse sometimes.
Now, the first member of the Marcus family we meet by name is Sherry Marcus, the matriarch of the family. And she's swimming in her backyard in West Palm Beach, Florida. And she has created this wonderful backyard tableau with a garden and a lovely pool. And it's this facade of beauty and harmony that also it's just a facade of beauty and harmony for the Marcus family as well.
I love getting the chance to describe the Florida backyard. I knew that the book had to be set in Florida. The real story does take place in Miami, and I wrestled with how much to change from the real crime story and when I was fictionalizing it. And there was a brief moment, I have to admit, when I thought about setting it in Memphis, because I know it so well. And I thought, this is not a Memphis story. I felt like I couldn't give up the Florida landscape. I really loved the feeling of the hot, sticky, swampy feel of Florida. It felt like the right landscape to write about an enmeshed family and a family that's so entangled. And I love describing her swimming pool. She swims every day, and the garden over the course of the book gets a little wilder and more entangled as the emotions ratchet up in the novel. And I just, when I would write the book, I just envisioned her swimming back and forth. I felt like there was something both calming for her about being in the pool, but something about that back and forth motion to me was a way to explore the sort of growing feeling of unease and anxiety and escalation. And so those were my favorite scenes to write in the book.
And Sherry and her husband Solomon, everyone calls him Saul, have moved down from the Northeast after he has a bad experience in the professional world. And it's like they've become unmoored from any network they might have back home, back east. And it's kind of cut them free. And it seems this freedom allows for things that people normally wouldn't be willing to do.
Right. I think Florida becomes, for Sherry at least, a chance to start over. Saul really views himself as a real Bostonian and has a sense of still longing to be in his Boston hometown. But for Sherry, she felt like her own dissatisfactions with her family, with her small family of origin, and Florida becomes this new open landscape, a chance to remake herself. She considers herself almost like a native species to Florida, where Saul always feels out of sync there. But she moves to Miami when her children are young with the feeling that here anything is possible. And she has such a longing to create the family that she did not have herself growing up. This feeling that when you have children, you can somehow heal your own past pain and recreate the tight-knit, close family that she wished she had as a child and did not have. And so Florida takes on this meaning for her. Her swimming pool becomes this, not just a place to swim, but this hope that the children will all get along here. Her kids will swim together. They'll be a happy family. Everything here will be wonderful and perfect. And of course, it rarely works out that way.
And Saul had a very difficult relationship with his father, and that kind of leads him to withdraw when there are points of conflict at hand because he doesn't want to make the same mistakes as his father did, so he makes brand new ones.
Right. There's so many ways to make mistakes. Isn't that just such a nice fact of family life? But right, his father was an angry person or had a temper, and so Saul, when there is conflict in the family, he chooses to stay on the sidelines, which is one of the central dynamics I was interested in exploring in the novel. And Sherry is the one who is in the fray. She has 3 children, but her 2 boys do not get along with each other as children. And that's a fact that really comes forward into the present day of the novel. Even as adult children, they still bear the wounds of their childhood pains and their childhood disagreements. And Sherry is always trying to referee their fighting, trying to placate, because really what she wants more than anything is for everyone to get along.
And neither of the sons realize someone else has to mention that they were essentially fighting for their father's attention.
Yes. We fight about one thing, but there's always a subtext of what's being fought about. And I think the real wound in that family really is this urge for their father's attention, to be seen by a parent. And I think for both of them, there's this urge for approval, for some sort of unconditional love, and to be seen for who they really are.
Now, the oldest is Nate, and he's actually followed in his father's footsteps into the medical practice. But it wasn't quite so certain that he would be successful. He was a pretty troubled kid growing up.
Yeah, so Nate is the oldest child. He's kind of impulsive. He's a little brash. He was always getting in trouble when he was younger. He was sort of the problem child in the family, but also someone who had a lot of friends, was sort of, in some ways, the golden boy, but not quite. He had this sort of strange way of his mother always saw him in his best possible light. And he was a wonderful big brother to his younger sister, Haley, but did not get along with their middle child, with Adam. But his father, I think, always sees him in a negative light, sort of can't get past the way Nate has misbehaved and feels like Nate is always trying to provoke him. Nate takes a certain pleasure in drawing out his father's temper. And I was interested in how that childhood dynamic, what happens when we grow up? Do we still enact our childhood dynamics with our parents and our siblings, even as adults? And so Nate does follow into his father's footsteps and becomes a dermatologist as well. And they go into practice together. And a good chunk of the novel takes place in the office, in their dermatology practice.
It's almost a little bit of a Jacob and Esau dynamic between the two boys.
Right. There's a good son and a bad son, and that is always shifting. I think we occupy different roles at different times in families. And Nate is the bad son, but he also is the good boy. And I think they're all sort of asking that question of who is good and who is bad. That was really one of the real questions I was interested in. What does it mean to be good and what does it mean to be bad? And as the book unfolds, as family dynamics begin to shift, Nate has a chance to sort of take on a caretaking role in the family and to sort of claim this mantle of being the good child. And for him, that is actually enormously appealing.
Now, Adam is the middle child, and he is not the first, like Adam of the Bible. And he could not be less like his brother possible.
Right. Adam is just completely different from not just from the family, but from the story the family tells about themselves. They sort of have a family mythology. We are so close. We all get along. We're all so similar. And he's really different from them. He doesn't share their way of seeing the world. He's a lot quieter. He's sort of much more introverted, doesn't appreciate Florida the way they do. And he really feels at odds in the family. And I was so fascinated by the way that people talk about how every child grows up in their own version of the family. And so the fact that Haley sees the parents one way and Nate sees it a different way, Adam has this really different experience of feeling like he doesn't belong in his family. He feels like he's not loved and seen for who he is. And he ends up being estranged from the family, which is one of the real exacerbating factors in the book. I think in order to write a book in which people do something so unimaginable, I felt like there had to be multiple things going on, multiple forms of escalation. It wasn't just that their daughter is getting divorced and the divorce spirals out of control, and so they hire a hitman. I feel like that is not really enough of a sort of sequence of events. I felt like there had to be so many other things going on in this family that pushed their buttons, that turned the screws on them further and further. And Sherry is so focused on this question of how do you protect your children and what happens if you feel like you might lose closeness to a child. And so for her, having a child who is estranged from her gives her a taste of what that's like. It makes her realize that, yes, you can lose closeness with a child, which is such a terrible blow to her. And so that piece of the book felt important in order to explore both why a child would cut off from a parent, but also to turn up that dial on the escalation in the novel.
Now, the youngest is Haley, the daughter, and referred to as Sunshine. And she is more similar to her mother. She kind of adopts the party line her mother likes to sell.
Yes, Haley is the sunshine of the family. She's the sort of proverbial good girl who everyone adores and everyone gets along with and is so eager to please. And in writing her, I really wanted to explore her own conflict. On one hand, she wants to do what her mother wants. She's extremely close to her mother and wants to fit into the version that her mother believes her to be. And yet, as the book goes on, that sense of closeness comes under fire. She has to ask herself, who is she? What role does she play in the family? And to what degree is she complicit in what is happening in the novel?
Now, it's her marriage to Jonah Gelman, which forms the big tension of the book. And how did she and Jonah come to be a couple?
Well, in some ways, they're very different from one another. Jonah is a writer. I decided to make him a novelist because it was something I'm always interested in writing about, sort of the world of the writer. And he is someone who is quiet, is a little removed, a very strong confidence in his own abilities, but doesn't suffer fools easily, let's say. He has very little tolerance for people who don't think about the world the way he does. And maybe he's a little moody, a little withdrawn. And one of the things that draws him to Haley is he likes how nice she is. He likes that she is sunny and positive, but he doesn't really see her as an intellectual equal. And initially that doesn't bother him. And she takes some pleasure in the fact that he loves her for her brightness, for her happy demeanor. And I was interested in exploring how sometimes the things we love about someone can ultimately become the things that we really hate about someone. And that's what happens in this marriage. He comes to see her as being facile, as being unable to stand up to her mother. I think for Haley, she sees the way that her mother can be a little domineering, a little overbearing, but she knows that it's always from a sense of love. For Jonah, as the son-in-law, he does not give her that benefit of the doubt. He sees his mother-in-law as intrusive, and so much of their conflict is about this question of, can Haley stand up to her mother? Is she able to be her own person? And he, like many of my characters, are unwilling to budge. No one is really willing to back down in any way or give anyone any room. And he is sort of unrelenting in his wish that Haley could stand up to her mother, and to push back against her.
Yeah, unlike his namesake in the Bible, he does not want to be consumed by the big fish that is Sherry.
No, he is not going to be consumed by anybody.
Now, I did think it was very interesting that the men had traditional Hebrew names and the women didn't. And I was just wondering if there was anything that crossed your mind when it came to assigning names.
It's interesting. I have to say, when I first started writing the book, I used the real names of the people in the true crime story. That was sort of my way in. And so very early on, for the first year of writing it, that was the names I used kind of as placeholders. And then there came a time when I knew I had to change all the names. And it's hard to name characters. It's funny how there's so much power and weight resting on what you call them. And so I had long lists from all of them of what they were going to be called. And, I came up with them slowly. Sherry, so I didn't think explicitly about the fact that, you're right, the men do have traditional Hebrew names. It was probably, I believe everything in writing is on subconscious level. But I thought about Solomon. I thought a lot about the sort of peacemaker, the classic tale of the Solomonic trial about two women who are fighting over a baby, and the baby is cut, and the Solomon proposes cutting the baby in half as a way to settle the claim. And I felt like in the novel, a custody battle really is about cutting a baby in half if people cannot compromise. And so I think that was why Solomon felt interesting to me as a name. I also thought about just that he is solemn, and that felt to me like the right name. The other names, Haley, I wrestled for a long time with what her name should be. I wasn't sure. And sometimes it's just by feel. With Adam, I just had this moment. I was like, oh, that works as a name. But maybe it had to do with, Adam is an animal lover and lives in a sort of a jungle-like, Eden-like paradise. Maybe there was some of that. But I think with names, there's a way, we all have so many associations with names that are based on people we've known over the years. And so I just try to kind of follow my instinct. And there's always a moment where I feel like, oh, that feels right. I feel like this is what their name is.
Now, in some very technical, small stuff I found interesting, though, in the book, is that in the first chapter, there's a different font from the subsequent chapters of the book. It's like a much smaller, tighter font. And I just wondered if there was you could speak to that artistic choice.
Sure. Well, there are two threads in the book. The book moves back and forth between the family sections that are primarily in West Palm Beach, and it goes into the points of view of all the family members. And the second section takes place in Maine, like the opening, which is Haley many years later looking back at the events that have happened. And she's with her brother Adam. And Adam has left the family and runs a sort of dog sanctuary. And so the book moved. I really early on knew that I wanted the story to flip between these two time threads. And when I wrote the book, I always kept the sections that take place in Maine in blue font. So I refer to them as the blue thread. It was just how I would keep track of the movement in the book. And then when the book entered the publishing cycle, I really wanted them to be published in blue, which of course was not going to happen. But I asked the designer about a way to demarcate the sections, and they came up with the idea of the different font. And I wasn't sure about it. I was a little unsure if I liked the idea of 2 different fonts, but I decided to defer. They felt like it worked well, and so I just decided to defer to their sensibility about that it helps orient the reader because we are moving between 2 time sections and 2 points of view.
Now, as you mentioned, each family member has their own view of what the family dynamic was like, kind of like Rashomon, the classic Kurosawa movie. But do you, as the writer, do you have a firm view of what the truth is in the story?
Well, it's interesting. I love point of view. I mean, it's the thrill of being a novelist where you get to go into all the points of view. You know, in our own lives, we know our points of view. We live inside our own heads and we can hear what people say and experience their worlds, but we live inside our own point of view. And I think what draws me to fiction, and particularly to novels with multiple point of views, it's this chance to really inhabit what the world feels like to someone else. It's such a rare gift to be able to enter someone from inside them and to feel what they feel and to really see the world through their eyes. And so I feel like when I write from different points of view, I really make myself live there only. You know, when I'm writing Sherry's point of view, I want to feel her. I don't want to look at her from the outside and judge her and, be like, oh, why is she doing this? I want to ask myself, what does it feel like to be this woman? What are her pains? What are her longings? What is she afraid of? And so I inhabit all of them equally. Certainly certain ones are easier to write. For some reason, the Nate chapters were the easiest to write for me, which is kind of funny because I am nothing like him at all, but I could hear his voice in my head the easiest. But I came to feel that it wasn't one factor. There was no one person who was at fault. It required all the dynamics at play. It was sort of a perfect storm of everyone in order for such an outrageous thing to happen in the family.
Was there any point during the book where you actually surprised yourself what you came up with?
I did. I mean, part of the book takes so many years. Every time I made a change in the book, a big change, I would update my novel file. And so it was called New Novel 1. And by the time I gave it to my editor, it was called New Novel 58. So many, many changes along the way. And there were some changes that I, would plan out ahead of time and do them, and some of them that did take me by surprise. I think early on, I decided that I had to view the characters as if they could still turn back. I had to give them this kind of weird benefit of the doubt feeling, to feel like on page 1, they haven't committed a crime. They are people who are doing the best they can. And I had to continue to view them that way until a point of no return. And I don't want to give anything away, but there is a plot twist in the book. It was funny for me to have such a sharp plot twist. My other novels are not as plot-driven and plot-oriented. I don't feel like I have other novels where there's a real plot twist that I'm not going to tell anyone about. But in this book, I did want to explore what happens if you upend readers' expectations. You start off the book thinking you know what's going to happen. You know from page 1 that this man has been murdered, and you're pretty sure that you know how it happens, but you're not always right with what you think is going to happen.
Well, Tova, I'm sorry our time has just run away with us. I want to thank you so much for coming in today and sharing your book with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tova Mirvis is the author of We Would Never, which is published by Avid Reader Press. I'm Stephen Usery, and this is Book Talk.
You're watching the Library Channel, a broadcast service of the Memphis Public Libraries and the City of Memphis.